The US presidential election is now just days away. The question that a lot of you are probably asking is Kamala Harris in the lead, or has Donald Trump managed to take pole position yet again? What could tilt the balance? Now, all of those questions are valid, and in fact, we're going to talk about it on this edition of US Election Watch with Ramesh Damani. My name is Alex Matthew. Joining me in studio is our very own cephalogist on the US election, Ramesh Damani. Ramesh, pleasure as always having you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for kind words. And I am a great student of the US electoral process, so it's a great privilege and a pleasure to come and talk with you about it.
Okay. Now, comedian Will Rogers has said that a fool and his money are soon elected. And that's an interesting question, interesting statement, because it's something that you were talking about as well. It's about the money that they're able to raise and the fact that Donald Trump is being able to raise money.
Well, actually, that's not quite true.
Oh?
Money is the mother's milk of politics,
yes,
especially in America. And how did they get Biden to resign from the, not to be rerun the office? Nancy Pelosi and her, hench people, if you will, to use a bad word, told them to stop contributing.
Yeah.
And without the money, Biden knew he couldn't run. The game was over. The writing was on the wall.
Yeah.
Kamala Harris came back. The Democratic donors came back. Surge of poll. In fact, she's out keeping money than Donald Trump.
She's raising far more.
In the last 3 months, she's raised almost $1 billion.
Wow.
Which is the record amount for any US presidential cycle ever. $1 billion. Donald Trump, believe it or not, despite being a billionaire, is running behind that. And what has happened because of that, he has to go hat in hand to non-competitive states to try and raise money. He had a very angry meeting with his donors, Miriam Allison, Stephen Wilson, that they underappreciated, unloved, that they should contribute more to his campaign. So he's also not being able to buy the airtime for television commercials,
wow,
which is so important, online strategies, hold big meetings. So I think Kamala Harris, in terms of money at least, has done an outstanding job. Almost $1 billion raise in 3 months.
So, but then doesn't that tell you that despite, and look, we look at these predictions, if you can call it that, or where things are heading, but if this is really the clincher, the amount of money that one candidate is able to raise over the other, then the writing is on the wall.
Well, Trump is fond of saying that if money was the only criteria, Hillary Clinton would have been president.
Right.
So, and she had raised more money than Donald Trump, but didn't become president. America is a very divided nation, and sometimes it's in a few counties, a few votes will determine the winner. For example, in the 3 states that Biden won in 2020, I think the difference in the total vote was less than 50,000 votes. There's an interesting story I'll share with you,
yeah,
Alex. In the 1960 election, there was a lot of talk in the press that Joe Kennedy, John Kennedy's father, was buying the election out for his son. So to finally quell the queries, John Kennedy announced a press conference, and while he was talking to reporters, someone came with a telegram to him. He opened the telegram and said, "Oh, this is for my father." He says, "Jack, I'll buy you enough votes to win the election, but not for a landslide." And that put that controversy to rest at that time. So it is quite important how the last few weeks of the election shape up, what the so-called October surprise that everyone is waiting for, how that happens. But that's what makes this election so fascinating.
Also, what makes it fascinating is the candidates themselves and what they're doing and what they're saying in the run-up to this election. But it's been said by Stalin, apparently, that people who cast the votes don't decide an election. The people who count the votes do, and seemingly Trump has said the same thing. What is he thinking?
It's Trump 101. Basically, to any time something goes against him, that the establishment is against him, the deep state is against him. Trump is such a maverick candidate who's broken the mold in so many respects. In 2016, when Trump was running, he actually made a press statement saying that my base is so strong that if I went on Fifth Avenue and shot a few people, I would still get all their votes. And that seemed the most laughable thing possible. And it is actually true. His base has stayed with him no matter what has happened, no matter what policies happened, that base has stayed with him. He also said, McCain is not a war hero. And if there's any certified war hero in America, it is John McCain, ancestor of 3 great admirals in American history. And that didn't affect him. So Trump is his own maverick, goes into his own head. And I think he breaks the rules of politics. And because he has the base, that strong support of 45, 47, 48% of the voters, I think he gets away with impunity. So this election, not like many others, is always at the margins. If you can just push a few people in a particular racial profile or a particular soccer moms or some other demographic, you probably win the election. But it's almost like a trench warfare, each man on his own, each woman on his own.
So you spoke about this briefly in the last conversation about the Electoral College and the popular vote. And the reason I'm asking about this right now is what you've just mentioned. Any one cohort of individuals could sway the election. It's that close, right? Where through the campaigning, you've had Kamala Harris go to make certain statements, position herself in a certain way in order to sway certain demographics. Do you think that that will be the clincher?
It is, and the interesting part is Trump is addressing Women's Conference, trying to reach out to women voters. Kamala Harris is coming, God forbid, on Fox News, which is the ultra right-wing network. She's coming to speak there. They're just trying to get those marginal voters who would be watching Fox News, or a woman who would be against Trump, but maybe willing to listen to them. The thing that I find interesting is that there's a huge gender gap in America, Alex.
Yeah.
Among all women voters, Kamala Harris is ahead by 15 points. But among all male voters, Trump is ahead by 15 points. So almost a 30-point gender gap in America. Women favor Kamala Harris, men favor Trump. But what is astonishing to me about Kamala Harris's position, this is a black woman of black and South Asian descent. She's not carrying the black vote as handily as Biden carried it, or as handily as, say, Clinton or Obama carried it. So she's, particularly among black men, she's winning, but she needs to carry 80-85% of the vote, and she probably has 65-70% of the vote. And that could perhaps make the difference. So there's a big all-out push to get the black vote home. Obama going and talking to that constituency as only Obama can, saying, please don't stay at home, and please don't think that you don't have to vote for Kamala Harris, directly addressing black men. So it's a very, very fascinating group that 10,000, 20,000 votes in a particular county could sway the entire election.
Last question on this, and we've got a conversation lined up with Professor Larry Sabato up next.
He's truly an expert.
Yeah, and from my perspective, okay, I'm curious about this. In our elections here, we talk about voter turnout being an issue. Is that at all something that worries, political strategists and watchers of the U.S. election?
See, Lincoln said it best. It's followed. The key to winning an election is get out the vote.
Yeah.
Right? And whoever gets out the vote more, in fact, if it's a heavier turnout, that tends to favor Democrats as opposed to Republicans.
Yeah.
And unlike in India, for example, where the elite don't vote in India, but the poor line up for all hours, and you can see long lines of them voting.
Yeah.
In America, it's the other way around. The elite go out and vote. They vote early. They vote regularly. And the working men don't vote.
Yeah.
So if the working men who typically support the Democrats turn out, vote in larger numbers, for instance, early voting in Georgia, which is a swing state again, points out to a Democratic victory, because early vote tends to help the Democrats, who tend to vote earlier than the Republicans. So it would be who gets the vote base out. You ring the phone, knock the doorbell, make sure your voters go to the polls and vote.
Go old school.
Old school, and I think the person who has the advantage in the ground game right now is Kamala Harris. So if she manages to bring home the vote, she may be the next 47th president of America. And now it's time to get an expert view on the US election. The communist leader of China, not a capitalist but a communist, Mao Zedong, famously said, politics is war without bloodshed. War is politics, but with bloodshed. Politics in the US, of course, has become a blood sport. To help us understand this ongoing gladiator fight for the position of leader of the free world, I'm joined by the founder and director of the Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, Larry Sabato. Larry, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much.
Larry, let me start you off with a hypothetical question. If it was still Biden versus Trump, would Trump be picking his cabinet right now?
Probably. I suspect he would already have picked it. President Biden was fading rather quickly, and it was obvious that it was more a matter of Democrats being unenthusiastic, whereas Republicans believed they had the election wrapped up. Well, a funny thing happened, and the Democrats were able to get it together and ask Biden to leave, and he did. And it turns out his vice president's a good candidate. She's done well so far.
Yeah, I mean, as far back I can remember only Johnson voluntarily quitting the White House in 1968, as you recall. But let me ask you a question. Are we flipping the coin? Is now Trump too old to be president? Is that the fear?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when Trump was running against Biden, Trump was the junior partner. He looked hale and hearty. He was 4 years younger, and it really did help him. The problem now is he is actually going to be the oldest person ever elected president should he win November 5th. And he will be the oldest president ever at the end of that 4-year term. So Biden's record will be shattered by the next president. He has come across as, if not suffering from dementia, then at least not on his game. Let's put it that way. He's done some odd things in and out of his usual lectures at rallies.
A lot of word salads, if I could say that. But let me ask you this question. There's a very famous humorist that you're familiar with, Groucho Marx. He said that all people are created equal except Republicans and Democrats. So what is this wanted base that we keep hearing about of Donald Trump? The Republican base, the base, the base. How important and how significant is the base for Republicans?
Well, that base is now the Republican Party. Most of the non-Trump Republicans have been driven out of the party one way or another. And some of them aren't participating at all. Others are reluctantly voting for Trump because that's what they've always done. They voted for the Republican nominee. But this is having long-term consequences for the party. Not that Trump cares. I think we all have figured Donald Trump out, for better or worse. Donald Trump is for Donald Trump. And he's perfectly happy with the Republican Party as it's now constituted. Whether it will produce any more victories in the future is another question entirely.
Larry, in 3 elections, in 2 elections in the past, Trump has never won the popular vote. Does the base mean that he gets a minimum, but there's also a hard glass ceiling to his vote percentage?
Yes, that's a good way to put it. He has a ceiling, I think, of 47, maybe you could stretch it to 48, but I don't see him ever getting over 50%. I just don't think it's possible because he has too many built-in opponents, and he reinforces those opponents almost every time he gives a rally. He says something outrageous or 10 things that are outrageous. However, his base will turn out in large numbers. So the burden is placed on the shoulders of the Democrats. They have to get their base, which often finds excuses for not voting, to turn out at the same rate. If they do, they'll at least win the popular vote. The Electoral College vote is something completely different these days.
You know, that's an interesting point, and I think my viewers in India will not understand that though this is a direct election between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, the winner of the popular vote doesn't win the election. The winner of the electoral vote wins the election. What is the electoral vote? Can you just explain it to us, to ordinary viewer here?
Yes, I won't go into too much detail except to say when the founders of the United States established the Electoral College back in 1789, there was no popular vote. We didn't have elections except through the Electoral College. Now, who were they? They were the elites of each of the American states. And they didn't meet together, but they met in their respective state capitals, and they picked candidates that they felt were appropriate to the presidency and the vice presidency.
I think it was called the smoke-filled backrooms in the 1960s.
Yes. And they all smoked back in 1789. I think by the 1960s, some were catching on that smoking was bad for you. But nonetheless, it's not a system that works very well, but it will stay in place because in America, we're too divided to change anything. Seriously, we cannot pass a constitutional amendment to celebrate mothers.
So you have a famous crystal ball, Larry. You predicted a lot of the previous elections. Gaze into your crystal ball. Tell us what's happening. Who's ahead right now?
This is extremely close, and I don't use that as a cover. I rarely say that an election is too close to call, but we've got 3 weeks to go, and regardless of our systems, every country knows the final 3 weeks of an election campaign usually determines the election result to a great degree. So I'm expecting what we call in the States October surprises. What they are, well, they wouldn't be surprises if we knew in advance. But usually something or some things happen domestically or internationally that push a point or two in one direction or another, and that's the election.
And potentially, you know, Harold Wilson said that a week is a long time in politics, and we're 3 weeks away. Are you looking at the Middle East, or are you looking at some domestic surprises? What would be the kind of surprise? I know it's a surprise, but what would you bet on?
Well, internationally, we're sure to have surprises in the Middle East. And we need to remember the guy who is stirring the Middle East pot to a greater degree than anybody else is Benjamin Netanyahu. And Prime Minister Netanyahu very clearly and openly wants Donald Trump to win. So I would expect him to do something that would put the Biden-Harris administration in a bad light and help Donald Trump. I can't tell you precisely what that is.
Of course.
It's cooking in Netanyahu's mind.
Geopolitics obviously is important. But let's talk about more politics. The vice presidency is always said to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. Let's talk about the two vice presidential candidates. Let's talk about Tim Walz first. I mean, to me, studying US history, Walz strikes me as the Sarah Palin of 2008. Is that too harsh an assessment?
Oh, I wouldn't call him Sarah Palin. Sarah Palin's in a class by herself, and probably always will be in terms of being unprepared for the national role, much less being vice president. And sure enough, she's faded from the scene entirely because she couldn't sustain her popularity to the extent that she had it. But I would say Walz was a weak choice. Turns out he wasn't as weak as the Republican choice. Both of these candidates picked poorly. Obviously, to everybody in politics here, Kamala Harris should have picked the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro. I mean, she wouldn't have to worry about Pennsylvania now. Duh, exactly. duh.
I agree with you. I mean,
they didn't get along. They didn't get along in that interview. Or he came on too strong. That's what I've been told by one of the people who knew.
But Larry, I mean, would you trust Coach Walsh? He's a great guy. He's a good governor, perhaps, good football coach. But would you trust him with the nuclear keys?
Yes, because I don't think he'd use them. And to me, that's the primary criterion. You don't want somebody in there who would actually use them, which is what people worry about with Trump, though he didn't in his first 4 years. I don't know why that would change, because after all, he has a big family. Some of those family members wouldn't survive either. I mean, it comes down, as I said, to Donald Trump. What benefits Donald Trump?
Final question, Larry. November 5th is D-Day. Trump is still litigating 2020. Will he accept a defeat?
Oh, God, no. You know the answer to that. It is impossible for him to lose. And therefore, if the vote tally shows that he has lost, clearly somebody cheated. That's the way it is in his mind. We all laugh at it, but we need to remember tens of millions of Americans hang on his every word, and that is the potential for violence after the election.
So they hang on to his every word, and his words have been, I'm going to introduce tariffs, I'm going to get out of NATO, I'm not going to support Taiwan against China. Does that worry you as an American citizen?
Of course. Of course, and it depends on what happens with Congress. If Democrats somehow manage to have one of the two houses of Congress, they can stop most of these things. But listen, Trump won't even necessarily listen to Congress. And he's got the Supreme Court on his side. It's a Trump Supreme Court. So we're in a situation where, in this particular case, Donald Trump is going to get a great deal of what he wants in all probability.
He will. Though, of course, in America, I realize you have to pass a bill through Congress, which is not necessarily easy. That's the check and balance in your system.
Yes.
You know, Larry, I'm fascinated by U.S. politics. And I'm going to throw a few names out to you. And I want you to comment on what you think about them. Two names I didn't share with you first. Kellyanne Conway.
Well, I know Kellyanne. She's a friend. She's participated in a lot of my programs over the years. She is not necessarily agreeing with Trump on lots of issues. However, she
Or
has
with George
become,
Conway.
well, yeah, well, George is the opposite. That's her, I guess, former husband. I know they're in divorce court. I don't know whether it's over yet. But George Conway is the leader of the anti-Trump bunch, not just Republicans, but also independents and Democrats. So it's an interesting former marriage.
Liz Cheney.
Well, I have a conflict of interest there. I hired Liz Cheney a year ago to be our professor of practice at the UVA Center for Politics. I think a great deal of her. She has guts, and so many people in public office in every country have no guts.
Do you think she could be potentially a candidate for 2028 if Trump loses in 2024?
Yes, but she couldn't be a candidate in the Republican Party, because her Republican Party, the party of her father, former Vice President Dick Cheney, is dead. It's gone. So she would either have to run as a Democrat, which would be difficult because she has conservative positions on a number of other issues that Democrats wouldn't like. And running as an independent in this country is always possible, but it's extremely difficult to pull off.
Tucker Carlson.
Well, again, I think I've taught one or two of his kids. They went here. He's participated in events at my home on Thomas Jefferson's lawn. He's a great person. He's a lot of fun. He's also now crazy. I have no idea where he's coming from or why he has done what he's done. He's lost his position on Fox, which was really the source of his power. So I wish him well, and I know he made tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions. So he's set for life, but we're not going to be seeing as much of it.
Trump and Tucker Carlson both seem to like Putin for whatever reason. The final name I'll tell you, Gavin Newsom.
Well, he has a future. His problem is that Kamala Harris has gotten out in front of him. She was senator from California. He's governor of California. He had hoped to be the nominee and might have run had they had an open process. But of course, it was too late for an open process. So I still expect him to run for president at some point, but I can't tell you when that is.
You know, I always remember that, Larry, when 1962, when Nixon lost the race for governor of California, he said, you won't have a Nixon to kick around anymore. I don't know about Gavin Newsom, if he'll be there or not, but I clearly think he has a future because he's telegenic, big state, Democratic loyalist, probably has a future. You know, the US election is on November 5th, or in roughly 3 weeks. I can only quote Ralph Nader, who said, turn on to politics or politics will turn on you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much. That was fun. Thank you.
All right, so there you go. Ramesh, fascinating conversation, sitting on the sidelines and in studio with you. The excitement and the insight that he brings is so fascinating.
Absolutely. He's you know, one of those people who speaks on US politics so authoritatively that it's always a pleasure to have him.
Lots more coming up on NDTV Profit.